Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last presentation of this symposium this morning. I'm Desai Shan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in Dalhousie University with Ocean Frontier Institute now. And in this return to work partnership project, I will be working on policy and practice in return to work in maritime industries. Under the supervision of Professor Barb Neese and Professor Catherine Liepel. So similar to Dana, this postdoctoral project is at the planning stage. So any comments, feedbacks, or suggestions will be extremely helpful and very much appreciated. There are five parts of my presentation today. So at the very beginning, we will have a look at the maritime working activities. If I may, I would like to refer to Chris' earlier presentation. So the differences of return to work and workplace injuries, the difference could be found significantly across sectors compared to provinces. So that's why we are looking at this maritime working activities in this presentation. So secondly, occupational health and safety challenges for maritime workers and workplace injury risk in maritime sectors will be examined. We will have a look at 4 groups of maritime workers, including seafarers, fishing harvesters, offshore oil and gas workers, and longshore workers. And later, I will present and discuss the return to work in shipping industry, some findings from our earlier mobility on the move research project. So seafarers and managers' concerns about return to work reported in the previous study. So finally, I will discuss the research plan and some expected outcomes. So first, let's have a look at the labor process of seafarers. Working at sea usually include complicated labor process. It's not just working on board, but sometimes they also need to be required to conduct certain operation in port and anchorage. So for example, on board, seafarers are in charge of watchkeeping, piloting through narrow waterways, marine engineering, shipping and punting, maintaining and repairing machine and equipment, cooking and waste management. So working at sea is actually you bring everything. It's a total institution. So all the living and working activities are conducted in a confined environment. But at the same time, in the port, when they need to do mooring, anchoring, loading and discharging cargo, fuel and water loading, cargo hold cleaning, those are also complicated labor process. So it's not a single task, but actually a multiple tasking labor process in maritime industry. Fishing industry, fishing labor process share some similarities in terms of the navigation and the equipment maintenance and boat maintenance with the shipping industry. However, because of fish harvesting, the special working nature, they also need to conduct the diving for fish and free nets, and then nets maintaining, handling and repairing, and crewing for fishing vessels, shoving ice, cooking, and working as porters. So in port, the workload for fishing harvesters is even heavier. So in addition to loading and unloading fish, they also need to cleaning and salting fish. And sometimes marketing activities will also may be requested. So offshore oil and gas drilling activities. This activity actually sometimes in most provinces, as far as I know, in BC and in Newfoundland, offshore oil and gas is included under the occupation of oil and gas and mining. But this is also a very important type of maritime work. So the reason I said that it's a maritime work is it also shares similarities with the shipping industry. So work in a remote and offshore environment. Although we may think that the platform is fixed at sea, but actually it's always moving. So dynamic positioning is a special skill required to make sure that the platform drilling vessel is stable. So offshore oil and gas industry actually share similar labor force with the seafaring industry. So many seafarers in my previous study, actually they also possess the dynamic drilling, dynamic positioning certificates, and will be called to the offshore oil and gas drilling industry sometimes. So longshoremen, or I should say longshore workers, stevedores or dockers. So those are the synonyms for this type of work. So at the very beginning, one may be curious why longshore workers will be termed as maritime workers. So they are actually land-based, they work in the terminal. But if we take a close look at their working content, we will find that they need to do loading and unloading and checking cargo to and from vessels. And the majority of their labor process is conducted on board. So longshore workers are also involved in the storage of goods and docks and in warehouses. So their working places is basically shared between at sea and in port. And in my previous career as a maritime lawyer in China, actually what my personal finding in the law job is actually longshoremen is more vulnerable compared to seafarers. So when we receive maritime personal injuries, highly probably the person killed in a fatality on board is a longshoreman. And because they need to conduct the cargo work in the confined cargo hold on board. So they also share some similarities with the seafarers. And in Canada, this similarity is also confirmed by law. So Canadian Maritime Occupational Health and Safety Regulations is also applicable to longshore workers if they work on board. So they are recognized legally as a group of maritime workers. So if we summarize some common characteristics of these four groups of maritime workers, we can find that maritime workers are working in remote and isolated working environments, ships, offshore oil drilling platforms, port and terminals. So their jobs involve high-level mobility, as we actually clearly identified in our previous research project. So the frequent mobility between places of residence to port to offshore platform. And in addition, they also require to work extended hours to ensure just-in-time transport. This is also echoed to Dinah's finding in previous presentation. So except longshore workers when working at sea, seafarers, fishing harvesters, and offshore oil and gas workers only have very limited access to medical service. So for example, on the merchant ships and offshore oil and gas industry, there may be no medical service, but they get some telephone medical service. But for fishing harvester, probably the situation would be worse because they may also not be able to contract with a stable telemedicine consultant. And for seafarers, in particular young and low-ranking seafarers, as well as longshore workers, may work on seasonal daily contracts and waiting for their job opportunities in hiring halls. So that actually is another issue about precarious employment in this transportation industry, which is also a research component of our research partnership. So due to the high level of mobility of the work, inevitably, many maritime seafarers are subject to overlapped area between federal and provincial jurisdictions. So for example, shipping industry, maritime seafarers, they are actually clearly regulated by the Canadian Labour Code, Part 2, as well as the Canadian Maritime Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. So those are the federal jurisdictions. However, although previously in history, seafarers' workers' compensation is also subject to a federal act, but generally this type of management is phased out. And seafarers' workers' compensation nowadays are subject to provincial regulations. Fishing occupational health and safety issue is even more complicated. So for the vessel and equipment safety that are subject to Transport Canada's Federal Occupational Health and Safety, Transport Canada's fishing vessel safety regulations. But fishing workers' rights to occupational health and safety and workers' compensation are provincial issues. And we also conduct some preliminary research on secondary data. We also find that basically most of the maritime workers are exposed to higher risk of workplace injuries. And now we will have a detailed look into this problem. So fishing is well acknowledged as an occupation with high risk of injury and fatality. And in Canada, if we take Newfoundland and Labrador and BC as example, we can find the average injury rate per 100 fishing workers is between 2.2 to 3.6, which is above the average injury rate between 1.5 to 2.3 of the provincial average. And similarly, seafaring is recognized as a global risky occupation. So according to an international study conducted by Dr. Lefquith in Yale University, and he found that the 4-year overall cumulative incidence rate for injuries and illness were equal at 8.5 per 100 seafarers. So this calculation, this statistics approach include both injuries and illness. So we are not 100% sure about the injuries, but other Danish research showed that 1 in 11 seafarers reported they suffered certain kind of injury in their recent tour of duty. So that is very high rate of injury among the international seafaring industry. So what about Canada? So I got the data from the WorkSafe British Columbia. So if we take the seafarers in BC as an example, we can find the injury rate is about 4 per 100 seafarers, which is about twice the provincial average. Longshore workers have an even higher injury rate. So similarly, this is also the data from the WorkSafe BC. So from this chart, we can find that the longshoring industry is about 6 to 8 per 100 workers, the injury rate, which is about 2.5 to 3 times higher than the provincial average. So probably in our impression, we may feel fishing workers are exposed to highest risk, but if we actually rank fishing workers, seafarers, and the longshore workers, we can find actually fishing workers' injury rate, as reported in BC, is lower compared to seafaring, and seafarers' injury rate compared to longshore workers is even lower. So all these 3 groups of maritime workers, their injury rate is obviously higher, significantly higher compared to the provincial average. Probably the only exception may be the offshore oil and gas industry. But as I mentioned earlier, the offshore oil and gas industry is calculated under the general oil and gas industry, which means land-based oil and gas and mining industry also calculated. So according to Newfoundland's and Labrador's data, we can find the mining, oil, and gas industry's injury rate is lower compared to the provincial average. But we have no idea whether that is because of the land-based industry, land-based oil and gas industry is lower, actually affect the offshore oil and gas industry's data. So we need to take further examination of the raw data of the offshore oil and gas industry to better understand the injury rate of this industry. So if the most maritime workers are exposed to a higher injury rate of the workplace injuries, then there should be more workers' compensation claims. And as a consequence, there should be an increasing need for return to work. However, in the current literature, it's very difficult to find any study examine return to work experiences of a maritime worker. So what may happen to them? So in our previous study on occupational health and safety experiences on the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River among Canadian seafarers, we received certain reports from our interviewee. So the first one is reported by the chief engineer Delta, and basically, this would inquire about what other occupational health and safety challenges you have come across. And he said that return to work to accommodate a seafarer would be occupational health and safety challenge for him. So in this account, he said that the company has a right to request a review of the health certificate issued by Transport Canada. If they do not do it, then there are liabilities and fines for the violation for employing and putting the seafarers back to the sea with physical restrictions. But WSIB decides that injured seafarer is employable with restrictions. They try to send a worker back with a broken leg. So in this account actually illustrates certain issues existed in the maritime industry. So first, there is a health certificate. So as a qualified or competent seafarer, they need to be certified by the Transport Canada. And to get that certification, they need to acquire health certificate. And one requirement of that certificate is that the seafarer is able to carry and lift a weight of 22 kilograms. So from this chief engineer's perspective, he thought that with a broken leg, it's impossible for seafarers to fulfill that requirement. But because the health certificate is subject to federal jurisdiction, it's Transport Canada's medical service issue that certificate. But workplace injury is reported to the workers' compensation provincially. So there is a lack of exchange of communication between these two authorities. And as a result, legally speaking, from all the certificates, this injured seafarer with a broken leg still hold a valid health certificate, and WSIB has a good point to send this injured seafarer back. But that may cause an early return to work, and it's also very dangerous for this injured seafarer. As I mentioned earlier, there is very limited medical service on board. So if this injured seafarer still needs medical service, then the situation would be very challenging. So there are also challenges for the employers, reported by the employers when they need to accommodate injured workers. Abraham is a general manager of a tanker company, and when inquired about occupational health and safety challenge in his management, and he reported this. He said that modified work is almost not possible on a vessel. As to work on a ship, you need all your faculties, both physical and mental. If any of these are disturbed, such as broken arm or such, how are you able to function in an emergency situation? So in this case, when we're talking about occupational health and safety challenge, chief engineer and the employer report that to accommodate a early to return injured worker would be their health and safety challenge. But he also gave an example about a kind of successful accommodation to a return to work process. So in this case, he accommodated a chief engineer, which this chief engineer had been taken off for pretty severe mental issues. And his doctor signed off him to return to work after some treatment. And although the general manager personally questioned the doctor and reminded or educated, very strong word used, the doctor as to the responsibility of a chief engineer role on board a ship. In this particular case, a tanker, so basically carrying oil and chemical products. And the doctor reversed in this his decision. But as a company, Abraham and his company decided still to accommodate this chief engineer with some office work. So not all seafarers may be such lucky. As some background information, chief engineer is the top 4 managers on board. So basically is the leader of the engine room. So this, in this case, to accommodate a high-level managing worker probably would be an exception. And also consider the shipping industry and all other maritime industries, vacancies at sea is much, much more compared to office-based work. So to accommodate a seafarer or other type of maritime worker will not be an easy job in this industry. So considering the gap in the current literature, there is very limited research on seafarers and other maritime workers' experiences of return to work, and also some challenges reported by seafarers and managers as employers in accommodating injured maritime workers in our previous study. For this research plan, we have raised 4 research questions. So the first one is, what will happen to the injured maritime workers once they are healed? Are they able to continue their career at sea? In my PhD study, finished in 2007, I explored Chinese seafarers' experiences of workers' compensation claims. And among those seafarers, basically the common fate in front of us is not back to sea. Either they start their own self-employed small business, or they join kind of friends business. So it's very hard or challenging for them to continue their career at sea. So we would also like to explore that in Canada. And second question is, are there any barriers that hinder the return to work process for maritime workers? The third one is, are there any barriers for maritime employers to arrange return to work accommodation? Finally, we will look at the regulations. So are there any conflicts between regulations, increase the difficulties for employers? As we can see from the pilot project, the Federal Maritime Personnel Regulations and the WICIB's return to work regulation may be in conflict, but we need to look into this in further detail. So to address the 4 research questions, we propose a social-legal interdisciplinary research approach. So first, we will conduct a legal doctrinal analysis on occupational health and safety, workers' compensation, and human rights legislations to identify maritime workers' rights and for sustainable return to work. And as a second step, we will conduct a fieldwork component, which include semi-structured interviews with union representatives and to explore how they support injured maritime workers in their return to work process. And we will also conduct interviews with maritime workers to document their return to work experiences after workplace injuries and try to identify systematic barriers and challenges for them. And we will also consult maritime employers to identify the barriers related to policy and industrial practice in accommodating injured workers. Okay. And some expected research outcomes. So from the knowledge perspective, we aim to better understand the impact of workplace injury on maritime workers' career and life to fill the research gap. And secondly is how the return to work process works in the maritime industries, any challenges or solutions. So based on this knowledge accumulation, we aim to raise some potential policy recommendations, because currently the marine personnel regulations is under revision. And one major purpose of this revision is to harmonize the conflicts between some federal and provincial regulations. The medical certificate issue and the workplace injury that was raised in this consultation process in front of Transport Canada. So we hopefully through our research to propose certain solutions or recommendations to harmonize the conflicts between these 2 regulations, in particular federal and provincial in the maritime sector. So that's all about my presentation. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your comments.